I want to show you in today's video a popular atheist actually imply that a dead man buried himself in the Bible to try and make the Bible actually look bad. But in the process, he actually ended up looking very foolish. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise because even in the same video, I'm about to show you multiple different clips of him doing the same thing, looking very foolish. Now, the fact of the matter is, I'm really running out of energy and desire to make video responses to this particular individual making videos about the book of Genesis. So please keep me in your prayers. The first clip I want to show you is really one to just get your feet wet and see the theme of where we're ultimately going. Because in this particular clip, he talked about how popular individual from the book of Genesis, a man named Abraham, ultimately was finding a new wife. I'll play some of the clip now and listen to what he says.
No, seriously, where did he meet her? Did he meet her locally? Because that would probably make her a Canaanite, and the last chapter was all about why Abraham's son Isaac wasn't allowed to marry a Canaanite.
Now, this doesn't make sense on many different levels, but think about what he actually said. Where did this particular father get a wife from? Because if he got a wife from this particular location, he just forbid his son from getting a wife in the same place. He didn't say he wouldn't take a wife from that place. He said his son would not take a wife from that place. So this was just something very basic. What you're going to see next is another big blunder before we even get to him implying a dead man buried himself. So let's go into this clip next, but the next clip we're going to talk about after is Hemet Meta is actually going to do some basic maths. He's actually going to crunch some numbers, as he says, and you're going to see a big blunder he did as well. But before we get into that, right, this clip I'm about to show you is really vital because 2 times in this particular video, he's talked about one of Abraham's sons, a man named Ishmael, and he's basically highlighted how Abraham sent him away and he didn't give him anything.
Speaking of kids, it's nice to see that Ishmael came back. I'm not sure why, considering Abraham left him with nothing, but it's a nice gesture.
Now, this doesn't really make any sense anyway, because when you go back to read passages like Genesis 17, God ultimately said to Abraham, don't worry about sending Ishmael away because I'm going to bless him. And listen to what Hemet Meta actually says in this particular clip because it's going to be very relevant. So before I play the clip, listen to how he introduces this part of his video when he's about to read it.
Really? More genealogy? I'm sorry, everyone. Don't get mad at me. I'm just the messenger.
So this was him speaking just before he read this family tree with this vital piece of information. You could see he's basically pointing out that this is actually really boring. Now, I'm not going to play him. I'll spare you reading the family tree, but he now read through this particular family tree, as you can see on screen. This particular phrase right here, which I've highlighted on screen, is very vital because this is significant. As I highlighted for you previously, you can see it talked about 12 princes, 12 rulers. Why is this vital and why is this a big blunder on Hemet Meta's part? Because what does he say right here in this same video talking about God ultimately sending Ishmael away, or Abraham sending Ishmael away empty-handed? Listen to what he says right here, which is vital.
I guess Genesis chapter 16 verse 12 was right. Ishmael really did turn into a wild donkey of a man.
So he has enough insights to look back to Genesis 16 and highlight something about Ishmael from then. But why didn't he have enough insights to go back to Genesis 17, where God said to Abraham and promised him, do not worry about sending Ishmael away. Why? Because I'm going to bless Ishmael and I'm going to make 12 princes come from his lineage. Why is that family tree he just read in Genesis 25 vital, where he's saying, oh no, this is boring, this is another boring family tree? Because this was testament in the Bible of God actually answering and giving Abraham the promise he actually said he would. So as much as Hemet Meta likes to harp on, oh, this is a boring part of the Bible, or this doesn't make sense in the Bible, etc., and loves to play up the comedic nature of his videos, notice that he has enough wherewithal to quote certain passages, but the passages he leaves out ultimately bury him because he's clearly highlighting his inconsistencies. And once you see this quite clearly, it makes him look very foolish. Now, I'm going to show you in a moment how he talked about a dead man burying himself. But before we do this, I said that we're going to get into some basic number crunching, right? He said we're going to crunch some numbers in his video. Now, what was he crunching numbers about? This is actually really funny.
If you crunch some numbers, Abraham lived 28 years after Sarah died. And in those 28 years, he met a new wife, had 6 kids, presumably met a bunch of concubines and had more kids, all when he was around 150 years old. What have you done lately?
So he talks multiple times in his video about Abraham being advanced in age and how Abraham is still able to have children. Abraham is quite clearly, based on the scripture, advanced in age. Hemet even reads in the passage in his video about how Abraham died at 175 years old, according to Genesis. Now, this will cause another problem for him in a moment, because what did he do? He says he wants to crunch some numbers, and listen to what he says.
If you crunch some numbers, Abraham lived 28 years after Sarah died.
I just told you a moment ago that the Bible gives us insight that Abraham died at 175 years old, and Sarah, at the time of Sarah's death, Abraham was actually about 137 years old. So let's do some basic math. So you can see here, if Abraham died at 175, let's put 175 on the calculator. Then we minus 137 years, because that was the age Abraham was when Sarah died. And look at the number we get. Do we get 28? No, we get 38 years. So considering the numbers are so similar, I would just assume that he basically just muddled up his numbers. But that doesn't change the fact that everything he said after ultimately was contingent on those particular numbers. So the dramatic effect he tried to go for isn't quite as punchy once we actually know he actually made a mistake. Now, like I said, we're going to get to him talking about basically implying a dead man buried himself in a moment. But before we do this, Hemet had another swing at the bat here when he tried to now quote other passages in the Bible, again to prove his case. We saw before how he tried to quote something else in Genesis, and it actually really made him look silly because it shows he's actually not following through contextually and is actually being inconsistent. Now what he spoke about here was he talked about how God hates Esau.
God doesn't like Esau either. In fact, in Romans chapter 9, verse 13, God says, "Jacob I have loved, but Esau have I hated." How bad do you have to be for God to spell out his hate for you in the Bible?
So he actually got a bit bold here and tried to quote a New Testament passage. The problem with that particular passage he's quoting is it's not fitting the context of what we're talking about here in Genesis, because that wasn't a quotation of God from Genesis. That was a quotation of God from Malachi. And in Malachi, in the Old Testament, it's basically the last book in the Old Testament. For those of you who are interested, God is not speaking here about the individual we're reading about, Esau. He's talking about the nation of Esau's descendants. Why? Because at this period in time, after hundreds of years, Esau's descendants now thought it was good of them to basically rejoice at their brothers, the Israelites, when they were ultimately being destroyed. So God went out of his way to say, because you were excited about these people being destroyed, I'm going to now destroy you. I haven't chosen you. I've ultimately chosen the Israelites. And even in the New Testament, there's a clear, popular example of a descendant from Esau, a king in the Bible, being offered the opportunity to have a relationship with God. So it wasn't like God was saying here, contextually to the Bible, that Esau had no opportunity basically to have a relationship with him in the bigger scheme of things. So we're now about to get to the climax of the video where he's basically implying that a dead man buried himself. And let's set this up very nicely. Why? Because earlier in the video, he made a point to talk about the particular wife in this particular passage who's mentioned by name, a woman by the name of Keturah. And Hemet goes out of his way to build a case to say that he believes she was about 20 to 30 years old.
If you do some quick math, Keturah had 6 kids. There's no verse here about a miracle from God, so she was probably at an age when having babies was normal. So she's young. Maybe 20s, 30s.
So we talked earlier on about Abraham dying at 175 years old, right? Bear that in mind because he talked about 28 years, 30 years ago, he basically began having children. So this woman he believes was 20, 30 years old is probably about 50, 60 years old at this particular point, according to Hemet Meta's calculations. Listen to what he says.
So much for Keturah. Nice knowing you, new wife. I'm gonna get buried near the person I actually love.
This makes no sense. Why? Because based on his own calculations, I'm not even saying they're right, but based on his calculations, Keturah most likely right now is still alive. So how would Abraham be able to be buried next to Keturah if she's alive and he's now dead? Also, another thing you need to consider here is Abraham isn't deciding where he's basically being buried. He ultimately bought a parcel of land for burial, yes. But at the end of the day, in his own video, he read about how his two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, were the ones that ultimately came to bury him. So you just saw an atheist try to imply that a dead man buried himself in his own grave to avoid a wife he didn't ultimately love. And we saw clear errors time and time again in his video talking about Genesis 25. And look what happened here when this popular Muslim accused a Christian of making up verses in the Bible.